The afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows of the Mitchell family home in Denver, Colorado, casting long golden shadows across the hardwood floors. Sarah Margaret Mitchell sat on the back porch swing, her feet barely touching the ground as she gently pushed herself back and forth. At 9 years old, she possessed the kind of wistful expression that seemed too mature for her years, the expression of a child who had already learned that the world wasn't always kind. Beside her, his massive golden head resting contentedly on her lap, was Buddy, her golden retriever and her most treasured companion in the entire world. Buddy had come into Sarah's life on her 3rd birthday. She could still vaguely remember that day, the golden puppy with his floppy ears and clumsy paws, tumbling across the living room floor while her parents laughed and her baby brother squealed with delight. Buddy had grown up alongside Sarah, and somewhere in those formative years, they had become inseparable. He wasn't just a dog, he was her confidant, her protector, her faithful companion through every joy and sorrow that childhood could offer. For the past 6 months, Sarah had watched her parents' marriage deteriorate with all the hyper-awareness of a sensitive child. It had started with small things, her father working late more often, her mother's forced smiles that didn't reach her eyes, tense conversations that would abruptly stop whenever Sarah or her younger brother entered the room. Then came the bigger signs: separate bedrooms, arguments that echoed through the house late at night, her mother's red-rimmed eyes at the breakfast table, her father's increasingly distant demeanor. Sarah had learned to retreat to her room with Buddy, closing the door against the storm brewing downstairs. Buddy would rest his head on her chest as she lay in bed, and somehow, his steady heartbeat and warm presence made the world feel slightly less terrifying. Just last week, everything had exploded. Sarah's parents had called both children into the living room on a Tuesday evening. Sarah remembered every detail with crystalline clarity: the way her mother had gripped the arm of the sofa, the way her father had stood by the fireplace looking like he wanted to be anywhere else, the way her little brother had asked, "Does this mean we're getting a divorce?" Sarah had known already. Children always know. She could taste the bitterness of it on her tongue. But what had happened next had been even worse than the divorce announcement itself. As her parents explained the logistical details with the careful language of lawyers and therapists, Sarah's father had mentioned casually, "At least we'll split custody of the kids. But I guess we need to figure out the dog situation too." The words had hit Sarah like a physical blow, the dog situation, as if Buddy were an object to be divided like furniture or kitchen appliances. Her mother had immediately stiffened, and Sarah had watched as her parents' eyes met with a new kind of defiance. "I kept the house," her mother had said quietly. "Buddy comes with me and the kids." Her father's jaw had tightened. "I paid for this dog. I've paid for his food, his vet bills, his training. That's not fair, Linda." And there it was, the moment when Buddy transformed from a beloved family member into a piece of contested property. Sarah had felt the color drain from her face. She'd excused herself quickly, unable to bear hearing another word, and had gone straight to her room where Buddy was waiting, as he always was, ready to comfort her without needing any explanation. That night, Sarah had held Buddy tighter than she ever had before, her 9-year-old mind racing with terrifying possibilities. What if her father took Buddy? What if she was forced to live between 2 houses, never knowing where she'd wake up, and worse, never knowing if Buddy would be there? What if they decided to give him away rather than deal with the custody complications? The thought made her physically ill. Over the following weeks, Sarah watched her parents consult with lawyers. She overheard phone conversations about custody agreements and asset division. She noticed that every time she and Buddy were together, both her parents watched them with a new intensity, as if they were assessing the dog's attachment, building their case for who he truly belonged with. Her father started taking Buddy for special walks and extra training sessions, clearly making memories and establishing his own bond. Her mother, conversely, began taking countless photos and videos of Sarah and Buddy together, documenting their relationship as evidence. Sarah felt caught in the middle of something she didn't understand and certainly didn't deserve. She had done nothing wrong. Buddy had done nothing wrong. Yet both of them were being used as pawns in a game neither had consented to play. The divorce itself was difficult enough, watching her family splinter apart, understanding that she would no longer live under one roof with both parents, accepting that things would never be the way they were before. But the threat of losing Buddy took that pain and multiplied it 1,000-fold. Buddy seemed to sense Sarah's distress. He became more protective, more attentive, rarely leaving her side. When her parents argued, he would station himself at Sarah's feet, his body alert, as if he was ready to defend her from the chaos. When she cried, and she cried a lot now, he would press his nose against her face and whimper softly, his brown eyes full of concern that no 9-year-old should have to interpret. Sarah had tried talking to her parents about how unfair this was. She had cried and pleaded and begged them to understand that Buddy wasn't property, that he was her best friend, that losing him would destroy her. But her pleas had been met with sympathy and promises that everything would work out and we'll figure it out together, words that rang hollow because clearly no one was figuring anything out. The legal system was taking over now. Lawyers were involved. Court dates had been scheduled. And so, on this golden afternoon in February, as Sarah sat on the swing with Buddy's warm weight against her lap, she felt the enormity of what was coming. The courtroom battle loomed before her like a monster waiting in the darkness. She knew that in a matter of days, she would have to sit in a courtroom and listen to lawyers argue about her dog as if he were a commodity. She knew that a judge, a stranger who had never even met Buddy, would make a decision about his future. She knew that her feelings, her bond with this dog, might mean nothing in the eyes of the law. Buddy looked up at her, his tail wagging softly, his expression full of unconditional love. Sarah buried her face in his fur and whispered the words she didn't dare say out loud to anyone else. "Please don't leave me, Buddy. You're the only thing holding me together. Without you, I don't know how I'll survive this." Buddy pressed closer, his warmth and steadiness a promise that he would be there for her, no matter what. In that moment, Sarah made a silent vow. She would fight to keep him, by whatever means necessary. She would find a way to make someone understand that some bonds cannot be broken, some relationships cannot be divided, and some connections were so sacred that they transcended the laws and logic of the adult world. The sun continued to set over Denver as the girl and her dog sat together, facing an uncertain future but facing it together. The alarm clock on Sarah's nightstand read 6:47 a.m. when she woke with a start, her heart already pounding as if it had been racing through a marathon all night. She hadn't slept well, hadn't truly slept in days. Every time she closed her eyes, she'd envisioned the courtroom, the judge, the lawyers with their cold voices and colder words. Today was the day. The day that would decide Buddy's future, the day that would decide her future. Sarah lay in bed for a long moment, listening to the sounds of the house stirring to life. Downstairs, she could hear her mother moving around in the kitchen, the clink of coffee cups, the opening and closing of cabinet doors. Buddy lay curled up at the foot of her bed, still asleep, his golden fur catching the pale morning light filtering through her curtains. She reached down and stroked his side gently, careful not to wake him. She wanted him to rest. She needed him to rest. The drive to the courthouse would take 40 minutes, and she didn't know what the day would bring. Her grandmother had arrived the previous evening. Margaret Chen, Sarah's maternal grandmother, was a formidable woman in her 70s with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and eyes that missed nothing. She'd driven up from Boulder specifically to be there for Sarah, to provide moral support and to sit behind her daughter in the courtroom. She'd already embraced Sarah tightly that morning, whispering, "We'll get through this together, sweetheart. You're stronger than you know." But Sarah didn't feel strong. She felt hollow, as if someone had scooped out her insides and replaced them with cold dread. By 8:15 a.m., Sarah was dressed in the outfit her mother had helped her choose. A simple blue dress that was nice enough for court but comfortable enough to keep her from feeling suffocated. Her mother had also insisted she wear her hair in a neat braid and wear the small silver locket her grandmother had given her last Christmas. "You'll look presentable and sincere," her mother had said, and Sarah had understood the unspoken message. The judge would be looking at her, assessing her, determining whether she was a child worthy of keeping her dog. The courthouse was a large, imposing stone building on Spear Boulevard, all hard angles and cold architecture. Sarah's stomach twisted into knots as they parked in the lot. She could see other people entering, and with a jolt, she recognized her father's car parked just 3 spots away. Her father had arrived separately, which meant her parents would maintain distance even in the courthouse hallway. She imagined them passing each other without speaking, avoiding eye contact, the civility of their relationship having completely eroded. Her father's lawyer, Mr. Richard Harmon, was waiting inside the courthouse entrance. He was a tall man with graying temples and an expensive suit that shouted money and confidence. He shook hands with Sarah's father, who looked uncomfortable in his own formal attire. Sarah watched her father from across the hallway, and their eyes met for just a moment. She saw something in his face that she'd never fully understood before: confusion, sadness, and underneath it all, genuine love for her. But also uncertainty about whether he was doing the right thing. It didn't matter. Love, apparently, wasn't enough to stop this. Sarah's mother's lawyer, Ms. Patricia Morrison, was waiting with them as well. She was a woman in her 50s with sharp features and sharper eyes. She'd already met with Sarah's mother multiple times, and Sarah had overheard conversations about establishing primary caregiver status and documenting the pet's attachment to the child. Ms. Morrison nodded at Sarah with what she probably thought was an encouraging smile, but it only made Sarah feel more anxious. Inside the courtroom, everything was exactly as intimidating as Sarah had imagined. The ceilings were high, the walls were paneled in dark wood, and everything smelled like old books and authority. The judge's bench loomed above the rest of the room like a throne. There were rows of wooden benches for spectators, and Sarah was grateful to see that the courtroom was relatively empty. Just a few court staff and the bailiff, who was a large man with kind eyes that didn't match the severity of his uniform. The waiting was perhaps the worst part. Sarah, her mother, and her grandmother sat in the gallery behind where Ms. Morrison would stand. Sarah's leg bounced nervously, and her grandmother reached over and gently placed a steady hand on her knee. "Breathe, sweetheart," she whispered. "Just breathe." Then Judge Patricia Coleman entered the courtroom. She was a woman in her 60s, with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses. She moved with the kind of authority that came from years of making decisions that affected people's lives. She settled herself at the bench and organized her papers with methodical precision. When she looked out at the courtroom, her eyes were neutral, professional, devoid of sympathy. Sarah felt her heart sink. This woman had probably heard hundreds of custody cases. To her, this was routine. To Sarah, it was everything. "All rise," the bailiff announced, though no one had been sitting. Judge Coleman read through the case information, and Sarah listened in horror as her beloved dog was referred to in legal terms. The family pet, the asset in question, the disputed property. Buddy was discussed like furniture, like a car, like something that could be divided or awarded based on financial contributions and practical considerations. The judge explained that both parties had filed petitions for custody, and that today they would hear arguments from both sides. Ms. Morrison stood first. She presented her case methodically, like someone arranging pieces on a chessboard. She spoke about Sarah's mother being the primary caregiver for the children, about her establishing the family home as the appropriate place for the pet to remain, about the disruption that would occur if Buddy were separated from his established routine. She pulled out documentation, vet records, proof of regular veterinary care, photos of Buddy in the family home. Everything was presented with cold, clinical precision. Then it was Mr. Harmon's turn. He countered with equal fervor, arguing that Sarah's father had been financially responsible for Buddy's care throughout the dog's life, that separation would be traumatic for the pet, that maintaining a consistent relationship with the father required consistency in all family relationships, including with the dog. He presented his own documentation, his own evidence, his own logical arguments. Sarah sat frozen, listening to two adults argue about Buddy as if the dog were an inanimate object. She felt her mother tense beside her, felt her grandmother's hand grow tighter on her knee. She wanted to scream, to stand up and tell them all that they were missing the point entirely. Buddy wasn't a possession. He wasn't property to be distributed. He was alive. He had feelings. He had needs. He had loved both of her parents unconditionally, and now they were using him as a weapon in their divorce. The judge made notes throughout, her expression never changing. When would Buddy be brought in? When would she understand? Sarah didn't have to wait long. The hours stretched on like taffy being pulled and stretched and pulled again, endless and torturous. Sarah had lost track of time somewhere between her mother's lawyer's second argument and her father's lawyer's response. The courtroom had taken on a dreamlike quality. Everything felt unreal, disconnected, as if she were watching a movie about someone else's life rather than experiencing her own reality. She sat motionless on the hard wooden bench, her hands folded in her lap, her legs pressed together so tightly that her thighs ached. Her grandmother had tried to hold her hand at one point, but Sarah had gently pulled away. She couldn't bear any comfort right now. Comfort felt like betrayal, as if accepting comfort meant accepting the possibility that she might lose Buddy, and she wasn't ready to accept anything. Around her, the courtroom continued its mechanical dance. Ms. Morrison stood to present another document, a veterinary record showing Sarah's mother had brought Buddy in for his annual checkup last month. The implication was clear. Sarah's mother was responsible, vigilant, the better caretaker. Sarah watched her mother's face as the document was presented, saw the slight nod of satisfaction, the momentary confidence that maybe, just maybe, this strategy would work. Then Mr. Harmon countered with documentation of his own. He presented receipts, literally pages and pages of receipts, showing that Sarah's father had paid for Buddy's food, his flea and tick treatments, his training classes, his grooming. The financial argument laid bare for the judge to examine, as if love could be measured in dollars and cents, as if the amount of money you spent on a creature determined your right to keep them. Sarah realized with a sinking feeling in her stomach that she was watching a transaction occur. This wasn't a custody hearing. This was a transaction. Her parents were negotiating, presenting evidence, making their cases as if Buddy were a business asset rather than a living, breathing creature with his own feelings and needs. "Your Honor," Ms. Morrison was saying, her voice crisp and professional, "the evidence clearly demonstrates that the family home, now belonging to my client, is the most appropriate environment for the pet. The dog has lived in that home for the entire duration of his life. To remove him from that environment would constitute unnecessary trauma and disruption." Sarah's mind screamed silently. What about the trauma of being fought over? What about the disruption of having both parents treating him like a pawn in their game? "Furthermore," Mr. Harmon interjected during his turn, "my client has established a consistent and loving relationship with the animal throughout its life. The pet has bonded equally with both parties, and there is no evidence to suggest that the child's residence should dictate the pet's custody arrangement. Many dogs successfully maintain relationships between two homes." Sarah felt her breath coming in shallow gasps. They were talking about Buddy as if he were a utility that could be shuttled back and forth between locations. They weren't discussing his emotional needs, his anxiety, his confusion. They were discussing logistics and precedent and financial responsibility. She looked up at Judge Coleman, hopping desperately for some sign of understanding, some indication that the judge could see through all of this legal theater to the fundamental truth underneath. But Judge Coleman was taking notes, her expression one of practiced neutrality. She looked bored, Sarah realized with a chill. To this judge, this was Tuesday. Just another case, another dispute over property division. Sarah was just another anxious child sitting in a courtroom, not special, not worthy of particular attention. The realization hit Sarah like a physical blow. No one in this room actually cared about what she thought or felt. The lawyers didn't care. The judge certainly didn't care. Even her own parents, she was beginning to understand, were so caught up in their own anger and hurt that they'd lost sight of what this was really about. They cared about winning, about being right, about getting the dog as a symbol of something: victory, fairness, compensation for their wounded pride. But they didn't care about Sarah's actual experience of watching her world fall apart. She was invisible. That was the word that kept circling through her mind: invisible. Sarah was 9 years old, and she was sitting in a courtroom watching her most precious relationship be litigated like a property dispute, and everyone around her was acting as if her feelings were irrelevant. She was the child at the center of this custody battle. She was the one who had chosen Buddy as her anchor, her comfort, her reason to get out of bed on days when the sadness of her parents' divorce threatened to overwhelm her. She was the one who would suffer if he was taken from her. And yet her voice didn't matter. The law didn't care what she thought. The judge hadn't even asked her how she felt. Her grandmother seemed to sense her spiral into despair. She leaned close and whispered, "Do you want me to ask your mother's lawyer to have you testify, to speak for yourself?" Sarah considered this for a moment. The idea of standing up in front of all these people, of trying to put her feelings into words that a judge could understand, filled her with such terror that she thought she might be sick. What if she cried? What if she couldn't articulate why Buddy meant so much to her? What if the judge heard her words and still didn't care? What if her voice, the only voice that actually mattered, made no difference at all? She shook her head slightly at her grandmother and turned her attention back to the courtroom proceedings. The lawyers were now discussing visitation schedules, a proposal that Buddy would spend weekdays with one parent and weekends with the other. Sarah felt her chest tighten. She couldn't imagine a scenario where that would work. Buddy would be confused, anxious, moving between two homes, never knowing where he'd wake up. The constant disruption would stress him terribly. But as she listened to the lawyers discuss the logistics as though they were entirely reasonable, Sarah began to understand something fundamental about the legal system. It was designed by people who saw the world in terms of fairness and precedent and property law. It had no vocabulary for love, no mechanism for understanding the kind of bond that existed between a 9-year-old girl and her golden dog. The system was incapable of comprehending the sacred nature of their connection, because the system dealt in facts, documents, and financial responsibility, not in the ineffable, unmeasurable reality of unconditional love. Her eyes burned with unshed tears as she sat in that hard wooden bench, surrounded by adults who were supposed to protect her but who had instead turned her life into a transaction. Hours passed. More arguments, more documents, more presentations of evidence, each one feeling like a knife twist. At one point, Sarah caught sight of her father's face. He looked tired, uncertain, as if he was finally beginning to question whether he was doing the right thing. But it was too late for doubts now. The machinery of the legal system had been set in motion, and it would grind forward to its predetermined conclusion, regardless of whose heart it broke. Sarah sat in silence, invisible and voiceless, watching the fate of her most precious companion be decided by people who had no idea what was truly at stake. "We'll take a 30-minute recess," Judge Coleman announced, setting down her pen with a finality that made everyone in the courtroom shift and stretch. "We'll reconvene at 2 o'clock. The bailiff stood and everyone followed suit, the courtroom suddenly coming alive with movement and sound after hours of rigid silence. Sarah felt as though she were moving through water, her limbs heavy and disconnected from her body. Her grandmother squeezed her shoulder gently. "Come on, sweetie, let's get some air. There's a bench outside." But Sarah couldn't move. She sat frozen on the wooden bench, watching as her parents filed out of the courtroom through different doors, maintaining the careful distance they'd established. Ms. Morrison was speaking to her mother in hushed tones. Mr. Harmon was conferring with her father. The lawyers looked energized, as if this were a game they were winning or losing, not understanding that the real stakes belonged to a 9-year-old girl who felt like she was dying inside. Sarah's grandmother was saying something, her voice seeming to come from very far away. Sarah understood that she should stand up, that she should go outside, that she should try to eat or drink something. But her body refused to cooperate. She had entered a state of emotional paralysis, the kind that comes when a person has exhausted all hope and is simply waiting for the inevitable blow to fall. Then she heard it, the sound of a door opening on the opposite side of the courtroom. One of the bailiff's colleagues was entering, and he wasn't alone. "Buddy." Sarah's head snapped up as if pulled by invisible strings. There, on a leash held by a court officer she'd never seen before, was her beloved golden dog. He looked confused and anxious. His ears were pinned back, his tail was low, and his nose was working overtime, trying to make sense of the strange environment and all the unfamiliar smells. He moved with the hesitant gait of a dog who was stressed and uncertain, entirely unlike his normal confident stride. The court officer was consulting with another staff member about the dog's placement during the afternoon's proceedings, something about it being important for the judge to observe the animal's behavior and attachment patterns. The words barely registered with Sarah. All that mattered was that Buddy was here, and he was within reaching distance. Sarah was on her feet before she even realized she'd decided to move. Her grandmother tried to say something, but Sarah was already moving toward the dog. She didn't run. That would have been unseemly, would have drawn attention, but she walked as quickly as she could toward the confused golden retriever. "Buddy," she whispered, and the effect was instantaneous. Buddy's head whipped around, his entire body going rigid as he caught her scent. For a split second, he seemed uncertain, as if he was confirming that yes, this was really his Sarah in this strange, terrible place. Then recognition exploded through him like a physical force. He lunged forward with such intensity that the court officer holding his leash nearly stumbled. "Whoa, Buddy," the officer said, trying to maintain control, but Buddy had no interest in being controlled. He pulled with a desperation that matched Sarah's own, straining against the leash as if his very life depended on reaching her. Sarah dropped to her knees. The moment Buddy reached her, he knocked her backward, his front paws landing on her shoulders, his entire body trembling with an emotion so profound that it seemed to shake both of them. He was licking her face, her ears, her neck, every inch of her that he could reach, and Sarah was laughing and crying simultaneously, great heaving sobs that came from somewhere deep in her chest. "Oh, Buddy, Buddy, Buddy," she kept repeating, running her hands over his golden fur, checking him as if he might have been hurt, desperate to confirm that he was real and present and still hers. Buddy whimpered, a sound she'd never heard him make before. It was a sound of confusion and stress and longing and absolute devotion all rolled into one aching cry. He pressed his nose against her face repeatedly, and Sarah understood that he was trying to scent mark her, to make absolutely sure that when he was separated from her again, he would still remember her, would still know that she belonged to him. The court officer was watching them with an expression that had shifted from professional neutrality to something more human. Even he seemed to understand that what was happening between this girl and this dog transcended legal argument and courtroom procedure. "I'm sorry," Sarah whispered to Buddy, burying her face in his neck, breathing in the familiar scent of him, that mix of dog shampoo, his natural musk, and something indefinably Buddy. "I'm so sorry. I'm trying so hard to keep you. I'm trying." Buddy whined again, and his body language shifted. He stopped the frantic licking and simply pressed against her, his weight substantial and real and comforting. He laid his head on her shoulder, and his trembling gradually subsided. It was as if he was finally able to breathe now that he was in contact with her again, as if her presence was the only thing that could calm the anxiety that had been building inside him since they'd been separated that morning. Sarah held him like that for what felt like both an eternity and only a moment. Time had no meaning here. Nothing mattered except this, the two of them, reunited, confirming what the courtroom had been unable to acknowledge, that their bond was real, tangible, and absolutely unbreakable. "Promise me you won't give up," Sarah whispered into Buddy's ear, knowing even as she said the words that she was making a promise to him that she had no power to keep. "Promise me we'll figure this out. Promise me we won't be separated. You're my best friend, Buddy. You're my anchor. Without you, I'm just falling." Buddy turned his head slightly and licked her chin once, gently, a gesture that felt like a vow. Sarah's grandmother appeared beside them, her own eyes wet with tears. She didn't try to pull Sarah away. Instead, she simply placed her hand on Sarah's back and stood witness to something that no legal proceeding could diminish: the pure, unconditional love between a child and her dog. The court officer shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable with the emotional intensity of the moment. "We should probably get him back to the holding area," he said quietly, not unkindly. "Judge Coleman needs him for the afternoon session." Sarah wanted to scream. She wanted to clutch Buddy and refuse to let go, to demand that everyone understand that this moment was the only truth that mattered, that love was more important than laws, that Buddy belonged with her, and only her, and that was the end of the discussion. Instead, she released him slowly, running her hands down his sides one last time as if she could imprint the feeling of him onto her own body, so that even when they were separated, she could recall exactly what it felt like to hold him. "Go with them," she whispered. "Be brave. I'm going to fix this. I promise you, Buddy, I'm going to find a way." Buddy looked back at her as the officer led him away, his eyes full of a sadness that broke her heart all over again. But something had shifted inside Sarah during those precious few minutes. She had felt his heartbeat. She had held him. She had confirmed that what existed between them was more real than any legal argument, any document, any precedent. And somehow that made all the difference. The afternoon session began at exactly 2:00 p.m., and Sarah felt as though she had aged a lifetime in the 30 minutes since she'd held Buddy. Her body still remembered the feeling of him, the warmth, the weight, the solid reality of his presence. But now, as she retook her seat in the gallery, he was gone again, somewhere in the courthouse building, being held by strangers who didn't understand him, didn't know that he was anxious in unfamiliar places, didn't know that he needed reassurance and calm voices and the presence of someone he loved. Sarah's eyes were red from crying, and she tried to wash her face in the courthouse bathroom, but the evidence of her emotional state remained visible. Her mother had asked if she was okay, and Sarah had simply nodded without speaking. What could she say? That she'd felt him for a moment and now had to sit through more courtroom proceedings without him. That the reunion had only made the separation more unbearable. Judge Coleman returned to her bench with the same efficient movements as before. She arranged her papers, took a sip of water, and looked out at the assembled parties. "Let's continue," she said simply, and the courtroom machinery engaged once more. Ms. Morrison stood to present her closing argument. She spoke eloquently about stability, about establishing roots, about the importance of maintaining a child's attachment to her primary residence and primary caregiver. She painted a picture of a loving home where Buddy would be safe and secure, where he would remain in the familiar environment where he'd spent his entire life. Her argument was logical, well-constructed, and utterly devoid of any acknowledgement of what Buddy might actually feel or need. Then Mr. Harmon presented his closing argument, equally eloquent in its own way. He spoke about fairness to both parents, about shared responsibility, about the dog's ability to adapt to a two-home arrangement. He suggested that Buddy was young enough and healthy enough to manage a split custody situation, that many families successfully implemented such arrangements, that his client was entitled to a relationship with the animal he'd helped raise and financially supported. Sarah sat through it all in a state of suspended animation. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her breathing was shallow. She felt as though she were watching this happen to someone else, as if she were an observer rather than a participant in this nightmare. It was during Mr. Harmon's second rebuttal that Buddy was brought back into the courtroom. The bailiff opened the side door, and there he was, her golden dog still looking confused and stressed, his tail down, his ears slightly pinned. He was led by the same court officer who'd been with him during the recess. The officer positioned Buddy near the courtroom, where Judge Coleman could observe him, explaining to the judge that the dog's behavior and attachment patterns would be evident as the hearing concluded. Sarah felt every muscle in her body tense. Buddy looked worse than he had during the recess. The separation from her and the stress of the courtroom had clearly taken a toll. His breathing appeared rapid, his movements uncertain. He kept looking around as if searching for someone, that would make sense of this confusing situation. The lawyers continued their arguments, but Sarah barely heard them. All of her attention was focused on Buddy. She willed him to look at her, to understand that she was still there, that she hadn't abandoned him. But Buddy seemed lost in his own anxiety, the noise of the courtroom and the presence of strangers overwhelming his senses. Sarah's chest felt tight, as if someone had wrapped steel bands around her ribs and was slowly tightening them. She couldn't bear watching him suffer like this. She couldn't bear the thought that this might be his last memory of her for a while, confused, anxious, alone in a room full of people who didn't care about him. Something shifted inside her then. A desperate clarity cut through the fog of her despair. She couldn't control the legal system. She couldn't control her parents' behavior. She couldn't control the judge's decision. But there was one thing she could do. There was one thing only she and Buddy understood. The signal. It had started years ago, when Buddy was just a puppy and Sarah was a much younger child. She'd been sad about something. A birthday party she wasn't invited to, or maybe just a day when the world felt too big and overwhelming. Her mother had suggested that Sarah show Buddy how she felt, and in that childish way of communicating, Sarah had placed her tiny hand over her heart. She'd made the gesture slowly, deliberately, looking right at Buddy while she did it. Buddy, even as a puppy, had seemed to understand. His attention had focused on her completely. His body language had shifted from playful to attentive. It was as if he understood that this gesture meant something important, something that required his full presence and awareness. Over the years, their signal had evolved. When Sarah felt sad, when she needed Buddy to know that she needed him, she would place her hand over her heart and hold it there. And when she was ready to let him know her sadness, she would extend her hand toward him in a gentle beckoning motion. It was their private language, their unspoken conversation, their way of saying, "I love you, I need you, you're my everything." Sarah's grandmother would occasionally catch them communicating this way, and would smile with a knowledge that some bonds transcend species, transcend reason, and exist in a realm beyond explanation. Now, as the lawyers droned on and Buddy continued to look lost and anxious, Sarah made a decision. She slowly, deliberately placed her small hand over her heart. She held it there, feeling the steady rhythm of her own heartbeat beneath her palm. Her hand trembled slightly as she pressed it against the fabric of her dress. She waited until Buddy looked in her direction. When his eyes found hers, she held his gaze. She kept her hand on her heart and waited, making sure he understood that this gesture was meant for him. Buddy's head tilted slightly, his ears perked forward. Then, still maintaining eye contact with her dog, Sarah extended her hand in a slow, gentle beckoning motion. The movement was subtle. No one who didn't know what to look for would have understood its significance, but Buddy understood immediately. His entire body transformed. The anxiety that had been gripping him seemed to evaporate. His tail began to move, slowly at first, then with increasing confidence. He took a step towards Sarah, then another. The court officer holding his leash realized something was happening and tightened his grip, but the damage was already done. Buddy had remembered. Buddy understood. Even in this strange, terrifying place, even surrounded by unfamiliar people and sounds and smells, he remembered their signal. He remembered that Sarah loved him. He remembered that whatever was happening in this courtroom, their bond was real and unbreakable and more important than anything else. Sarah's lips moved silently, but her message was clear. I love you. I'm not giving up, you're mine." Buddy's tail wagged faster and he pulled against his leash with renewed purpose. Not in panic, but in recognition. In hope. In the absolute certainty that the girl who loved him was still there, still fighting for him, still trying to find a way. And in that moment, something profound shifted in the courtroom. Not everyone noticed it. Not everyone understood its significance. But something ineffable had occurred. A moment where the legal machinery of the court ground to a halt, if only for a second, confronted by the power of a bond that transcended all human logic and law. Judge Patricia Coleman had been a family court judge for 23 years. In that span of time, she had presided over hundreds of custody cases. Divorces, separations, adoptions, disputes over children and property and visitation rights. She had learned long ago to maintain professional distance, to see cases as legal puzzles rather than human tragedies, to make decisions based on precedent and law rather than emotion. It was the only way to survive in a profession that constantly asked her to make decisions that would alter the course of people's lives. She had settled into her judging career with a certain comfortable detachment. She was good at her job precisely because she didn't let herself feel too deeply. She had developed a particular ability to listen to arguments, absorb evidence, and render decisions without allowing her personal feelings to cloud her judgment. It was a skill she'd perfected over 2 decades. But something was happening now that threatened to crack that carefully maintained facade. She had been listening to Mr. Harmon's closing statement, a competent argument about fairness and shared responsibility, when she noticed movement in her peripheral vision. The girl, Sarah, the child at the center of this case, the one whose feelings no one had bothered to solicit or consider. Judge Coleman's eyes flicked toward the gallery, and she watched as Sarah slowly raised her small hand to her chest. The gesture was subtle, almost imperceptible to someone not looking closely. The girl placed her palm flat against her heart, directly over the place where her heartbeat would be. Her eyes were glistening with tears, but her gaze was laser-focused on the dog. Judge Coleman found herself setting down her pen. She had seen many things in her courtroom over the years. She had witnessed angry parents fighting over custody arrangements, had seen children coached to testify against one parent or the other, had observed the worst of human nature when pride and hurt and rage took precedence over everyone else's well-being. But she had rarely, if ever, witnessed something like this. The dog, Buddy, transformed before her eyes. One moment he had been anxious, his body language clearly communicating distress and confusion. The next moment, his entire being shifted. His ears perked forward. His tail lifted and began to move in a slow, deliberate wag. But it wasn't the enthusiastic tail wagging of a happy dog at play. It was something deeper, something that communicated recognition and love and an understanding that transcended species. Judge Coleman's breath caught in her throat. The girl extended her hand slowly, deliberately, in a gentle beckoning motion. It was a gesture so full of meaning, so loaded with significance, that Judge Coleman felt something crack open inside her chest. This wasn't a legal argument. This wasn't a case about property distribution or financial responsibility. This was a child communicating with her beloved companion in a language that existed beyond words, beyond the law, beyond the machinery of the court system. And the dog understood completely. Mr. Harmon was still speaking, still presenting his argument about shared custody and equal rights, but his words had become nothing more than background noise. Judge Coleman's entire attention was focused on the girl and the dog. She watched as Sarah's lips moved silently. She was crying without sound, the kind of deep emotional release that came from a place so fundamental that it couldn't be contained or explained. The girl's hand trembled slightly as she held it extended toward Buddy. Her eyes never wavered from his. And Buddy, despite the court officer holding his leash, responded with complete and utter devotion. He strained toward Sarah, not in panic or excitement, but in recognition, in love, in the absolute certainty of a bond that no court could break and no law could divide. Judge Coleman realized that she had stopped listening to the lawyers entirely. She had no idea what Mr. Harmon was saying anymore. The words had ceased to have meaning. What mattered was the scene unfolding before her, a 9-year-old girl and her golden dog communicating in a moment that seemed to exist outside of time, outside of the courtroom, outside of everything except the profound reality of their connection to each other. The other court staff were beginning to notice as well. Judge Coleman caught the eye of the bailiff, who had stopped his mechanical movements and was watching the girl and dog with an expression that suggested he too was witnessing something unprecedented. The court clerk, typically focused on transcribing every word spoken in the courtroom, had paused her fingers above her keyboard and was staring at the remarkable scene unfolding in the gallery. Even the lawyers were falling silent. Ms. Morrison had finished her argument some time ago, and Mr. Harmon was winding down now, his voice becoming increasingly uncertain as he seemed to sense that something had shifted in the courtroom's energy. He glanced at Judge Coleman to see if she was still listening, and when he caught sight of her expression, tears glistening in her eyes behind her wire-rimmed glasses, he fell completely silent. Judge Coleman didn't try to hide her emotional response. For the first time in her 23 years on the bench, she allowed herself to be moved by what she was witnessing. She set down her pen. She removed her glasses and pressed her fingers to her eyes for a moment, composing herself. What she had just witnessed couldn't be faked. No child could manufacture that kind of emotion, that kind of genuine desperation and love. And no dog could respond to something that wasn't real. The connection between Sarah and Buddy was absolute and undeniable. It existed in a realm that transcended all of the legal arguments and documentation and precedent that the lawyers had presented. Judge Coleman had spent 2 decades learning to separate law from emotion, to see cases as intellectual puzzles rather than human dramas. But in that moment, watching a girl and her dog communicate across a courtroom in a language older and deeper than any legal system, she understood that she had been wrong to do so. The law existed to serve people. The law existed to protect the vulnerable and ensure justice. But the law that failed to account for the sacred bond between this child and this dog was not serving anyone. It was failing them both. Sarah had stopped crying now. She was simply holding Buddy's gaze, her hand still extended in that gentle beckoning motion, her other hand still pressed against her heart. She looked so small, so fragile, so utterly determined. And in that moment, Judge Coleman saw her not as a custody case or a legal dispute, but as what she truly was, a child who needed her dog and a dog who needed his girl, and a bond that no court should ever attempt to sunder. The courtroom had become very quiet. Even the ambient sounds of the building seemed to fade away. There was only the girl, the dog, the beating of their respective hearts, and the electric connection that flowed between them. Judge Coleman took a deep breath and put her glasses back on. She looked out at the assembled parties, the lawyers, the parents, the court staff, and in her gaze was a newfound clarity and purpose. She had a decision to make, and unlike every other decision she'd made in this courtroom, this one would be based not on precedent or law or property rights. This one would be based on truth. The silence in the courtroom stretched on for several long seconds. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the ambient sounds of the courthouse seemed to have paused in respect for the moment that had just transpired. Sarah still sat in the gallery, her hand still extended toward Buddy, though the court officer had gently moved the dog back into position near the judge's bench. The dog's eyes remained fixed on Sarah, his tail continuing its slow, deliberate wag. Judge Coleman took several deep breaths. She put her hands flat on her desk and seemed to be gathering herself, marshaling her thoughts, preparing to speak words that she somehow knew would matter more than anything she'd said in her 2 decades on the bench. When she finally looked up, her eyes were clear despite the tears that had been there moments before. "I believe," she began, her voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of emotion that no one in the courtroom had ever heard from her before, "that we should take a brief recess before I render my decision in this matter." There was a collective intake of breath. Her parents exchanged confused glances. The lawyers looked at each other with uncertainty. Judge Coleman simply gathered her papers and rose from her bench. "Court will resume in 15 minutes," she announced, and the bailiff called for everyone to rise. In those 15 minutes, Sarah's mother kept asking what this meant. Was it good? Was it bad? Sarah simply stared out the courthouse window without answering, her mind replaying the moment when she and Buddy had connected across the courtroom, trying to decipher what the judge's expression had meant. When court resumed, Judge Coleman returned to her bench looking composed but with something fundamentally different in her demeanor. This wasn't the detached, professional judge who had presided over the morning session. This was a woman who had experienced something that had changed her perspective entirely. "This case," Judge Coleman began, setting down her prepared notes and speaking without reference to them, "has presented me with a legal question regarding the custody of a family pet during a parental divorce. On the surface, this appears to be a straightforward property division matter. However, what I have observed in this courtroom today has forced me to reconsider what we are truly discussing." She paused, and her gaze swept across the room, landing briefly on Sarah before moving to her parents and then to Buddy. "For 23 years, I have served as a family court judge," she continued. "In that time, I have presided over hundreds of custody cases involving children, property, financial assets, and yes, family pets. I have learned to approach these cases with professional objectivity, treating them as legal puzzles to be solved through the application of law and precedent. I believed that my role was to set aside emotion and render decisions based solely on facts and legal principles." She leaned back in her chair, her hands folded in front of her. However, something occurred in this courtroom during the afternoon session that challenged the very foundation of that belief. I witnessed a moment of communication between a child and an animal that transcended everything I understood about the nature of law, property, and justice. What I observed was not a custody dispute. What I observed was a sacred bond, a connection so fundamental, so real, so undeniable, that it cannot be addressed through the traditional mechanisms of family law. Sarah's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. "The legal arguments presented by both counsel were competent and well-reasoned," Judge Coleman continued. "Both parents have presented evidence of their financial contributions to this animal's care. Both have demonstrated some form of attachment to the dog. Under traditional property law, the case could arguably be divided along those lines. However, I am now convinced that to do so would be a profound failure of justice." She looked directly at Sarah, and her expression softened. "The child in this case, Sarah Mitchell, is 9 years old. She is a participant in a family dissolution that she did not cause and could not prevent. She has lost the intact family structure that was her foundation. She has faced the uncertainty of not knowing where she will live, how often she will see each parent, whether the stability she once took for granted will ever be restored. In the midst of all of this trauma and upheaval, she has had one constant: a dog who loves her unconditionally, who comforts her in her darkest moments, who represents a form of security and acceptance that is absolutely crucial to her emotional well-being during this transition." Judge Coleman's voice grew stronger, more passionate. "The law exists to serve people. It exists to protect the vulnerable. It exists to ensure justice. But what kind of justice would it be to remove from a traumatized child the one living being who is holding her together emotionally? What precedent are we setting if we suggest that a child's emotional needs are secondary to property division and financial fairness?" She turned her gaze to Sarah's parents. "I am also mindful that both of you love this child. Both of you want what is best for her, and therefore I must ask you, what is truly in Sarah's best interest? Is it the opportunity to fight over her dog in court? Or is it the opportunity to move forward as a family, restructured but not broken, where everyone's primary concern is her well-being?" Sarah's mother had tears streaming down her face now. Her father looked pale but thoughtful. Judge Coleman turned her attention to the bench in front of her, where her prepared decision lay. Therefore, I am rendering the following decision in the case of Mitchell v. Mitchell regarding custody of the animal known as Buddy. Sarah Margaret Mitchell shall be designated as the primary custodian of the dog. This is a decision I am making based not on property law, but on the fundamental principle that a child's emotional and psychological well-being during a family transition must take precedence over other considerations. She paused to let this sink in. However, I recognize that both parents have relationships with this animal and with this child. Therefore, I am establishing specific visitation protocols. Both parents shall have the right to visit with Sarah and Buddy during their scheduled parenting time. When Sarah is with her father, Buddy shall accompany her. When Sarah is with her mother, Buddy shall remain with her. In this way, the integrity of the child's primary relationship with the dog is preserved, while both parents maintain a connection to both the child and the animal. Judge Coleman's voice became even more measured, more solemn. Let me be clear. I am making this decision based on what I observed in this courtroom today. I observed a bond between a child and an animal that cannot be created artificially, cannot be manufactured through legal argument, and cannot be severed without causing irreparable harm to the child. My role as a judge is to recognize truth when I see it, and the truth I saw today was that Sarah and Buddy belong together. To separate them would be a profound injustice. She looked at both parents directly. I would also strongly recommend that both of you consider family counseling to work through the anger and hurt that has caused you to pursue this custody battle in the first place. Your daughter is watching to see how her parents handle loss, disappointment, and conflict. I encourage you both to model the kind of maturity and child-centered thinking that would truly serve her well-being. Finally, she looked at Sarah. Sarah, I know this has been frightening and difficult, but I want you to know that your love for Buddy is valid and important and worthy of protection. You may retrieve your dog now. The courtroom erupted. Sarah's mother gasped and began sobbing with relief. Her father closed his eyes, and Sarah saw something release in his face, as if he'd been carrying a weight he didn't know how to put down, and suddenly someone had given him permission. Sarah didn't wait for anything else. She was on her feet and moving toward Buddy before anyone could stop her. 6 months later, on a golden afternoon much like the one where Sarah had begun this nightmare, she sat on the back porch swing with Buddy once again. The summer sun filtered through the leaves of the tall oak tree in the backyard, casting dappled shadows across the wooden deck. Buddy's head rested contentedly on her lap, his golden fur warm beneath her fingers, his breathing steady and peaceful. Everything about the scene would have looked identical to anyone observing from a distance. A girl and her dog on a summer afternoon, nothing remarkable, nothing worth noting. But everything had changed. Sarah was different now. Not fundamentally. She was still the same sensitive, intelligent, loving girl, but something had shifted inside her. The anxiety that had plagued her during the custody battle had slowly receded. The panic attacks that had come without warning had stopped entirely. The feeling of helplessness that had become her constant companion had been replaced with a quiet confidence that came from having been heard, truly heard, by someone with the power to make a difference. The first few days after Judge Coleman's ruling had been chaos in the best possible way. Sarah had collapsed into Buddy, holding him in the courtroom while her grandmother laughed and cried simultaneously. Her mother had approached cautiously, as if afraid to interrupt, but when Sarah looked up, she'd seen something different in her mother's eyes, not the desperate determination to win, but genuine relief that Sarah would be okay. Her father had stayed in the courtroom after most people had left. He'd approached Sarah slowly, and she'd watched as he knelt down beside her and Buddy. For a long moment, he hadn't spoken. Then he'd placed his hand on Buddy's head and said quietly, "Thank you for loving her so much. I was so angry, I forgot what this was really about." Sarah had hugged him then, and she'd felt him crying against her shoulder. Something had broken open inside him too, some hard shell that had formed during the divorce proceedings, some belief that winning mattered more than his daughter's well-being. Judge Coleman's ruling had somehow freed him to acknowledge what he'd known all along, but had been too hurt and angry to admit that Sarah needed Buddy far more than he needed to assert his rights as a property owner. In the weeks that followed, Sarah's therapist had commented on her remarkable progress. The sessions that had been filled with anxiety and despair became sessions where Sarah talked about healing, about understanding her parents better, about learning that people could make mistakes and hurt each other without it meaning they were bad people. Dr. Martinez had given her grandmother a meaningful look during one session and said, "Whatever happened in that courtroom, it changed something fundamental for her." Her mother had started her own therapy as well. Sarah had overheard a conversation where her mother admitted to her own therapist that she'd used Buddy as a weapon in the divorce, rather than thinking about what was truly best for her daughter. It had taken Judge Coleman's words and Sarah's visible relief at the ruling to make her understand how much her own pain had clouded her judgment. The co-parenting arrangement had taken time to establish, but it worked far better than either Sarah or her parents had expected. When Sarah was with her father on weekends, Buddy came along. Those had become some of Sarah's favorite times, not because her father was suddenly perfect, but because the three of them existed in a space where everyone was trying. Her father had started attending a divorce recovery group, and he talked openly with Sarah about how he was learning to separate his hurt from his responsibility as her parent. When Sarah was with her mother during the week, Buddy remained her constant companion. Her mother had made changes too. She'd set aside her ambitions temporarily to focus on being more present with Sarah. She'd stopped trying to win arguments about the divorce and had instead started asking Sarah what she needed. The result was a relationship that was deeper and more honest than it had been before. 3 months after the ruling, Judge Coleman's decision had been featured in the Colorado Bar Association's journal. Legal experts had written analyses about how the ruling represented a significant shift in family court jurisprudence regarding pet custody in cases involving minor children. Several family law firms had reached out to Judge Coleman to discuss how her decision could be applied to other cases. The ruling had quietly begun reshaping how courts across Colorado approached similar situations. Sarah hadn't known any of that when she'd received a letter in her mailbox 4 months after the hearing. It was from Judge Coleman herself. "Dear Sarah," the letter began in elegant handwriting, "I wanted to reach out to you personally to check in and to tell you something that I hope you'll understand and appreciate. The decision I made in your case was one of the most important decisions I have rendered in my 23 years as a judge. You didn't just win a custody battle that day. You helped change how our entire legal system thinks about the bonds between children and their companions. Your courage in making that signal to Buddy, that simple, profound gesture of love, reminded me why I became a judge in the first place, to recognize truth and protect those who cannot protect themselves. I hope you know how much your case has meant to me personally. Keep loving that dog and keep being the wonderful person you are. Judge Coleman." Sarah had read the letter so many times that she'd nearly worn through the paper. She'd kept it in a special box beneath her bed, a reminder that what she'd done, simply expressing her love without words, had mattered. It had changed things. Now, on this summer afternoon, Sarah watched a butterfly land on a nearby flower. Buddy's eyes tracked it lazily, but he didn't move. He'd learned in the past 6 months what it meant to be at peace. The constant anxiety that had manifested in his stressed packing and whining had given way to the calm confidence of a dog who knew exactly where he belonged and who loved him. Sarah thought about everything that had happened. She thought about the moment in the courtroom when she'd made their signal. She thought about Judge Coleman's tears. She thought about her parents learning to separate their own hurt from her well-being. She thought about how sometimes the most powerful arguments aren't made with words. "We did it, Buddy," she whispered, running her fingers through his golden fur. "We actually did it." Buddy's tail wagged slowly, and he looked up at her with those soulful brown eyes that had seen her through her darkest moments. In those eyes was the reflection of everything they'd been through together. He'd been her anchor when her world was falling apart. And somehow, by simply being himself, by responding to her love with unconditional devotion, he'd changed the hearts and minds of everyone around them. A car pulled into the driveway, her father arriving for the weekend visit. Buddy's ears perked up slightly, but his body remained relaxed against Sarah's lap. This was home now. This was safe. Whatever changes happened, whatever transitions Sarah experienced between her mother's house and her father's house, Buddy would be there. And that made all the difference. Sarah heard her father's footsteps on the walkway, heard him pause to admire the flowers her mother had planted. She heard him climb the porch steps. And when he appeared in the doorway with a smile on his face, a smile that reached his eyes in a way it hadn't in years, Sarah smiled back. "Hey there, you two," he said, settling into the chair beside the swing. "How was your week?" "Good," Sarah said simply. And it was true. Her week had been good. For the first time in a very long time, her life was good. Not perfect, nothing was perfect, but good in the way that mattered. Good in the way that meant she could breathe, that she could be a child again, that she could trust that the people around her loved her more than they loved being right. Buddy extended his paw towards Sarah's father in greeting, his tail beginning to wag more enthusiastically. And Sarah's father, who had learned that sometimes the most important connections weren't about winning or losing, but about showing up with love, reached down and scratched behind Buddy's ears. "Good boy, Buddy," he said warmly. "Good boy." And in that moment, as the three of them sat together on the porch as the sun began its descent toward evening, Sarah understood that love really was the most powerful force in the world. Not the kind of love that fought and competed and tried to win, but the kind of love that was willing to change, to admit mistakes, to prioritize someone else's well-being above its own ego. Buddy had taught her that, and in doing so, he'd saved not just her life but her entire family.